Welcome everybody to our latest edition of Chamber Chat. Hope you're having a great 2020. Looking forward to this new year. There's so much to do when it comes to advocacy, government, and politics in 2020. And I can't think of a better person for us to talk to than our own Congressman Tom Cole. He very capably represents us from the 4th District. He's the second ranking member for our Oklahoma delegation in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we were so honored to have him as our guest today with Chamber Chat, and we're very honored to have him as our congressman.
Hey, thank you very much, Scott.
Tom, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
My great pleasure.
Now, each month we try to sit down with a policymaker or a decision maker like yourself, and I really try hard to learn a little bit about each person that I'm talking to personally. You and I have been friends for a long time. But I don't know that all of the folks that are tuning in today, they may not know your full story. You have a really diverse background, but you're, really homegrown. I mean, you spent almost your entire life right here in Cleveland County. And why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? I know that your father was in the military, and so you moved around a little bit, but thankfully home base has been here.
Both sides of the family have been here a long time. In the current 4th District, on my mom's side, we've lived here as a family for over 170 years. And on my dad's side for over 140. So while I was an Air Force brat, and I was actually born at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, we moved around the first 11 years. There was never any question we were going to be coming back to Oklahoma. And as soon as my dad hit 20, my mother insisted that was the time, and we were going to be Oklahomans, and my brother and I were going to be raised here. So I was back in Oklahoma by the time I was 11. We thought we were going to live in Ardmore. They had both been born in that area and had grown up graduates of Ardmore High School. So I actually started 6th grade down there. And there's an air base, which is now the industrial park north of Ardmore. And Dad thought he would get a job there. Well, he ended up getting a job at Tinker Air Force Base instead. He spent another 20 years as a civilian defense worker. And so we didn't stay in Ardmore where we'd been staying with my grandparents. We moved up to Moore, and this year I will have lived in Moore for 60 years. I'm 4 blocks from the house I grew up in, so I didn't get very far. But so Moore and certainly Cleveland County is home for me, but the district has been home for the family for generations.
So you graduated from high school was it
Moore High School? I'm a very proud Lion in 1967. There was no such thing as West Moore or any of these, or South Moore. That was the only high school in the town, and I had a great experience there. Played high school football there, and was a student council president up there. So it was a lot of fun. It was a great place to grow up.
Now, in your district office, you have 2 football helmets, OU and Grinnell.
I do.
Tell me about Grinnell.
Grinnell is where I ended up. OU is where I would have loved to have played, but I was much too small and too slow. But I ended up playing college football at Grinnell, which actually has the oldest football program west of the Mississippi. They played the first game, beat the University of Iowa 24-0. And actually, by the way, beat them for the next 4 times. They used to play Oklahoma State as late as the 1940s. Wow. They were in the old Missouri Valley Conference, but they were much too small to maintain that kind of program. So it's a D3 program, but one with a very proud history. And I got the opportunity to play there for 4 years. Loved it.
Now, what position did you play?
In high school, I was an all-conference and second-team all-city offensive guard. In college, I was a defensive end because I was too small, even at Grinnell, to play in the offensive line. So I started a couple years and, again, enjoyed it thoroughly. We had pretty good football teams back then.
So your education didn't end there, and I'd say you were the epitome of a student athlete because you went on to get some advanced degrees.
Yeah, I was very lucky. Well, I won a scholarship out of Grinnell. It's called the Watson Fellowship. So I had a year. I got married literally graduation day to my wife, now almost 50 years. But won a fellowship, studied in London for a year independently at a place called the Institute for Historical Research, which is connected with the University of London. Came back and started graduate school at Yale, got my master's there. Came to OU because the history market was collapsing, thought I would become a lawyer, did not like that, went back to history. We had a very good Victorian historian here who was later dean of the School for Continuing Education, a guy by the name of David Mayle. and got my doctorate here and had a Fulbright fellowship. So I was back at the University of London for a year on that. So and then ended up starting out. I was going to be an academic. Once I got my doctorate, I was teaching in the Grinnell Extension Program. I taught at OBU for a while. I was a graduate assistant at OU. So I thought I was going to be an academic.
That's so. Public service runs pretty deep on both sides of the family tree. Clearly, your father in the military, but your mother really blazed the path when it came to elective office.
Yeah, she was a really successful local politician. I mean, she was a state representative, Republican and female in the she was elected in 1978. There weren't very many people doing that back then. Then went on and served in the state Senate. Briefly interrupted that, retired. I took the seat actually, and then she came back and continued in the Senate when I left, and then also did a stint as mayor of Moore along the way. But the family actually been pretty political. Her grandfather was the last treasurer of the Chickasaw Nation before the advent of statehood in Oklahoma. And so the family and his father had been this elected position, the Chickasaw Nation Chief Justice of the, not Chief Justice, Chief Clerk of the Chickasaw Supreme Court. So there's multi-generations of politicians in the one side of the family and then a very strong military in the other.
So when you were achieving your history degrees, was there always a penchant for politics, or was that something later in life?
I think I was always interested in it. It was always talked about around the dinner table. My mother was, she really was a gifted politician. Look, I'm in politics because of my mom. There's no question about that. And it was watching her get involved. And look, she didn't have a college education. We didn't have any money. We were Republicans in what was a very heavily Democratic area. When she won her House seat, that was the furthest southern House seat that the Republicans held. Wow. And that was true literally until Ed Apple won a Duncan seat in 1986, 8 years later. So she was kind of a pioneer in politics, and again, very gifted at it. She was routinely one of the top legislators in the Capitol, got a lot of legislation done. Pretty tough competitor.
So was she your first client on
in a
the
sense,
consulting side of things?
She had run for, I never charged my mom, but she had run for office in 1976, her first race, and I was actually in graduate school at OU and living down here in student housing. And I didn't do very much. I was like most graduates. I did some, but not much. And she lost very narrowly. And I always tell people the worst place on the planet to be is your mother's watch party the night she loses and you haven't done much. Right. So I actually told her, I thought about the race for a few weeks, and I figured that she lost because she made the classic mistake. She tried to be both the manager and the candidate. She'd been very active in local politics. She'd managed other people's races. And so I told her, I think that's why you lost. You didn't have enough time at the doors. And if you do this again, I'll learn how to run a campaign. Well, I never thought she would, or I wouldn't have said that. And I'm literally in London in a Fulbright fellowship, and I hear from her, and it's, hey, I'm running. When are you coming home? And I was coming back in June because I was teaching at OU. And so I went in to see my advisor, and I said, look, I made this promise to my mom. I'm going to teach the courses because I need the money. But I'm going to basically suspend writing my dissertation and any further research on it until this is over. And they were actually very good with that. And they said, fine. So ran the campaign, and I fell in love with it. It actually sort of got me back in touch with playing football again. I always tell people politics is the ultimate adult team sport.
Sure.
And I said, a watch party room is a lot like a locker room after a game, win or lose. I mean, you fought with these people and bonded. You've had a common cause. It's a really neat feeling, whether it's politics or athletics, and you believe in something bigger than yourself. And I enjoyed feeling that again. So I just started running campaigns for free, just for fun. Local race, there was a lady by the name of Evelyn North. This is many years ago, won a special election for county commissioner, Ken Wilson. And finally, actually when Ken was running, this was several years later, and I was at a critical point in my studies, and he came and asked me, could you run this race? And I said, I really can't. I don't have the time. And I'd played football actually with his son. And he said, well, I'll pay you. And I said, you can get paid to do this stuff, really? And so he said, yeah. And so I did. He won the race. And not too long after that, I developed a reputation. A guy by the name of Harold Hunter was the Republican state chairman. He's the uncle, late uncle now, of our current Attorney General, Mike Hunter. And Harold had been a state legislator for about 10 years and then Republican Party chairman. And he basically made me an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, why don't you quit academic life for a year and be executive director of the Oklahoma Republican Party? That sounded much grander than it turned out to be, but I loved every minute of it. And ran it, and that was in 1980. And then after that, there was always a better political job in front of me. I was deputy campaign manager in a governor's race, and then I was a field rep and a district director for U.S. Congressman Mickey Edwards, then Republican state chairman, and then finally ended up in the state Senate with two partners, Sharon Hargrave, now Sharon Caldwell, and Debbie Long, now Debbie Snodgrass. Sharon's still president of the firm. Debbie was Secretary of Commerce for Governor Fallon. We set up our own consulting firm, which still exists today, still own a little piece of it.
So I know a lot of consultants or party individuals, and they rarely make that transition from doing that side of the issue and actually running for office. What was that like for you, transitioning from advising people to then hopefully taking some advice?
I think it was very interesting because, I actually think it made me a better consultant because I've gone back and forth at different points in my career, at least before I was Congress, because I really understood what it's like to sit there and make the calls to either voters or to ask for support from volunteers or to raise money in a much more personal way. But I remember thinking when I was running, I better win this race. I mean, who's going to hire a political consultant who loses his own race? So I better be successful. It was actually the time in 1988 in the state Senate was the most expensive legislative race in Oklahoma history. By not a little. We were both on television in Oklahoma City market. We both had polling. It was a really big grudge match between Democrats and Republicans. And I eked it out by over 26,000 votes by, I think, 311 votes. It was right down to the wire.
That's amazing. So our friend J.C. Watts gets in Congress and decides at one point in time to not seek re-election after a few terms. You decide to throw your hat in the ring. Now, remind us what year that was.
That was in 2002. J.C. was one of my star clients. I'd actually first met him when he was a Democrat back in 1990, but he was a very conservative Democrat. And I was a consultant. I was actually in the state Senate, and there was he wanted to run for lieutenant governor. And everybody in the Democratic Party was telling him, you can't win, you're African American. And he had a friend, a guy by the name of Ray Fine, who was an African American businessman in Tulsa. And I knew Ray from Republican activities. And Ray said, why don't you go talk to this kid, Tom Cole? He's pretty good at this stuff. And so I still remember to this day, J.C. came into my Senate office and we talked about 15 minutes. And I said, if you would run it, because he's so conservative. I mean, he's more conservative. He should be a Republican. I said, if you would run for office, I'd do your race for free. And thank God he never took me up on that. He always actually paid me very well. He was a wonderful client. We did 5 races together, Corporation Commission, statewide. And to win that year, it tells you what a good candidate is. He ran 17 points ahead of the top of the ticket and beat a sitting incumbent by 8 points. And he was the first, African-American Republican, first African-American ever elected statewide in Oklahoma. Only the second African-American Republican in the 20th century elected statewide any place in America. Only Edmund Brooke, who was an African-American senator in Massachusetts in the 70s, had done that. So it was an extraordinary accomplishment. I was sort of like the slow guy off the bench following J.C. Watts, but somebody had to run, and we had a 7-way Republican primary. I was able to win it without a runoff and then won a really hard-fought victory.
So you're now, as we said earlier, our second-ranking Republican from Oklahoma in the Oklahoma delegation, only behind Congressman Lucas. Tell us a little bit about your committee assignments, because I think they're quite impressive.
I've got great committee assignments. I said my principal committee is a committee on appropriations, which took me a number of years to get there. I now am the top Republican. I'm former chair of the largest domestic spending. It's called the Labor Age Committee. It's Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. Spends about $190 billion a year, hits every part. And then I'm the number 3, really number 2 Republican on defense appropriations. And then I hold the what's called the vice ranking, so the number 2 spot on the entire committee, underneath Kay Granger, who's in Texas, and she's the top Republican on the committee. Then I also sit as the top Republican on the Rules Committee. Most people don't understand what that is, but every bill in Congress has to go through the Rules Committee if it's controversial, if there's going to be a vote on it. And so we represent the Republican viewpoint there, and this is a committee that makes all the amendments in order. How long will the debate be? Will points of orders be? So it sort of is the traffic cop for Congress, and particularly if you're the chairman, which I'm not. It's a very, very powerful position because you can impact every piece of legislation. When you're sitting in the minority, it's a 9-4 committee split in favor of whoever the majority is. I've been vice chairman in the majority before. But those are the 2 principal committees that I sit on.
So, it's tough. We're in the beginning stages of this election year. I mean, I say beginning, just early in the year of 2020, but a lot's already happened. But there were some really successful pieces of legislation passed towards the end of 2019. You want to tell us about those?
Really quite a bit. It's really interesting. I call the first session of this Congress the schizophrenic Congress, because there's no question it's been pursuing impeachment for a long time, and that's what most people see, and it certainly occupies an enormous amount of energy. But on the appropriation side, remember we began this 2019 with a government shutdown, and that's because the appropriations work had gotten caught up in a fight over border funding. We solved those things and then passed in at the end of the year, every single appropriations bill. So there'll be no government shutdown in the coming year, with substantial increases for defense spending and some other big bargains, and an agreement, honestly, for next year as well, for this year that we're in. So we should be able to do it 2 years in a row. Then we also passed through the House. The Senate this year has now followed up. We passed in December the USMCA, big trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, hugely important for the country. We focus on China appropriately a lot, but we trade more with Mexico and Canada individually, let alone collectively, than we do with China. Those 2 countries get about 40% of our exports. So this is something the president wanted to renegotiate, did. All the studies we have say this will yield at least 170,000 new jobs, at least $70-80 billion of new economic activity for the United States. So it's a big deal.
Is that a update or replacement of NAFTA?
It's a replacement. Now, in some ways, a lot of NAFTA works, so that's okay. But this is a much better deal than NAFTA, and it includes things like electronic commerce, new things on pharmaceuticals. So it's a very good deal, and it probably strengthens our hand against China. I don't think it's coincidental that the movement of that led to phase 1 agreement with China. So that's been another big deal. So the trade issues all broke, and we have a trade agreement with most people miss with Japan that happened in September. Again, very advantageous. And for this district, this is actually a district that benefits a lot from trade. Now, the agricultural part of it, there's 14,000 farms in this district. Those markets are extremely important, but it's also a big exporter of oil field equipment and of other products as well. So free trade, air conditioners, things like that, you'd be surprised what comes out of this district. In ag alone, it's almost $1 billion a year worth of trade out of the 4th district alone. And of course, other parts of the state are even more agricultural. So getting that was big. Then in the approach bills, we also, Obamacare has been controversial from the beginning, but one thing that hasn't been controversial, both Democrats and Republicans have disliked some of the funding mechanisms for Obamacare. And one of them was a tax on all private health insurance, and that's 170-80 million Americans. Another one was a tax on what are called Cadillac healthcare plans. Actually, they're not Cadillac at all. They're usually what a good union can negotiate for its members. And then finally, there was a tax on medical devices, which to me never made sense because that's taxing you for being sick if you need a medical device. So Congress had postponed those taxes on a bipartisan basis, but had never eliminated them. This year, we finally got all three of them out of the system.
Wow.
So you like Obamacare, a lot of it is still there, but the mechanism that funded it, or we're supposed to, is not. And that tells you even the Democrats, blanched a little bit about that. So I consider getting those kinds of things, because those are things that hit the average person. I don't think very many Americans are in favor of seeing health care plans taxed. Most of them are getting their health care, the majority of them that way. And they're certainly not in favor of seeing somebody that needs a prosthetic limb or a ventilator, whatever medical device they need. We shouldn't be taxing that. They're expensive enough as it is. So again, those were some of the bipartisan achievements of Congress.
So looking forward to this rest of this year, this calendar year, do you see much action occurring, or is just the elections and impeachment kind of
There's a
suck all the
potential.
air
It
out
depends on what happens. There's no chance that the president is going to be removed. I mean, he's been impeached, but there's no way that there will be 67 votes in the Senate and to do that. So, but it does take time, and it does poison the atmosphere. So I think you have to have modest hopes for what can happen in an election year, particularly one that's going to be this intense. I think we can get all the spending bills done again because we've already agreed about what the top line number is, and we have to agree about each bill, but that's possible. I also think the big breakthrough of this year could be something like the drug pricing bill. There's actually 3 different bills out there, a bipartisan one in the Senate, so-called Grassley-Wyden bill. Speaker Pelosi has a plan that she's passed through the House but would never pass through the Senate or be signed by the President. The President has their own administration proposal out there. And while they're different, if you put them all together, there's actually some overlap in the middle where the 3 sides, that needs to get done. I mean, and it would lower prices, everything from more rapid approval of generic drugs to things that would lower some of the testing, not the requirements, but the over-regulation of it. So there's some things that I think we could do and should do. That's still a possibility. The politics of it, though, get tough. If you're a Democrat, do you want to give the president an election victory? Even though this would be a compromise bill, and you would have elements, if the incumbent signs it, the incumbent gets credit for it. So that's going to be a political decision left to the Democrats, but I think it's possible, and I think we ought to do it. Then again, I think there's still the chance for more trade deals out there. I would not expect phase 2 of the China deal. I think the Chinese will wait and see what happens in our own election and see if they have to deal with Trump anymore. But the United Kingdom, is leaving the European Union, and both Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, and the President have talked about a trade deal there. It would be very much in our interest and theirs. They need a trading partner leaving European Union. And then the President himself at the Davos conclave mentioned the desire for another major trading deal with Europeans. He was dealing with China. He had nailed down Mexico and Canada. The Europeans are very protectionist, particularly on automobiles, for instance. And now let's sit down and talk with our friends in Europe. So I think those kinds of things can get done, but I don't think substantial things are going to get done until we know who the next president is for 4 years, and we know what the balance of power in the House and the Senate are going to be.
So when you look at the landscape and you turn on the TV, a lot of times you see a high degree of rancor out there. But I've always been impressed whenever I hear you speak that you always talk about civility, you talk about hope for the future and in our government and in our process. What is it that maintains that for you, that you still have hope in the United States and in America, that while it may be tough today, you look in the past, and it's often not as bad as things we've come from.
Well, our country is, look, when your immigration problem is half the world wants to move to where you're at, probably tells you you're in a pretty good place. I'd be worried about America with the immigration issue. People want to leave, not people want to come. This is by far the place that provides the most opportunity, the most freedom, the most security of any place in the planet. And nothing has changed in that in the 20th century, except it's continuously improved itself. When I tell people I'm old enough to lived to drive through the South, and including Oklahoma, and seen signs like "No colored allowed." I mean, my son asked me once, he said, "How old are you, Dad?" I mean, wasn't that the Civil War? I said, "No, that's living memory." This country's improved itself dramatically. And that doesn't mean we're perfect or we don't have things to do. We do. We have a long way to go. But, I think you go broke betting against the United States of America. And we've been counted out many, many, many times. And the American people's decency, resilience, and frankly, just brilliance has always confounded the rest of the world. So I feel good about the country. In terms of politics, look, I've been at it long enough to know that just because I disagree with somebody doesn't mean they're evil, and it doesn't even mean they're necessarily wrong. They may be right. I think my position's right, and I think my party's right. But I think to get much done in divided government, and we have a Republican House, Democratic Senate, Democratic House, I guess that was wishful thinking, Democratic House, Republican Senate, and obviously Republican President right now, but very seldom do you have all three really lined up with sufficient majority, and even then Senate rules are such that the minority almost always counts. So if you can't compromise and bargain, you're not going to get anything done. There are very few absolute victories. And I think most people want you to move the ball forward. So I've tried to work that way, and I'm pretty careful about calling people names because you're going to have to work with them. I always tell people the House of Representatives and the Senate even more so, it's like living in a small town. Everybody knows who ties the church. Everybody knows who contributes to the girls' softball team and the boys' baseball team. Everybody knows who will loan you their lawnmower. Everybody knows who brings the lawnmower back. So you establish a reputation of being a jerk or being somebody that yells at people or can't sit down and deal with them. You're not going to be a very effective legislator. Mm-hmm. You may make people feel good at home. They may love it, but you're not going to get much done. And I think they said you're there to get stuff done. You were very much this way when you were a legislator, and you were very practical. And I don't think it's any accident you served on the Appropriations Committee. I served, but appropriations is a pretty practical business. Mm-hmm. Because we all know roads need to get built, kids need to be educated, the country needs to be defended. It takes money to do that. What are the right priorities with the money that we have? Sure. Appropriations is quite often a split the difference kind of deal, or persuade you something. I mean, one of the things I'm proudest of in my time as chairing the Labor Age, we fund two critical institutions for national health: the National Institute of Health, which does research, and the Center for Disease Control, which protects us from infectious diseases. Both those have been basically flat funded for 12 years. In 4 years, and now a fifth year, because my Democratic colleagues, I persuaded, agree with me. We've increased funding for both those agencies in the 30 to 40% range, and that means you're going to cure cancer quicker. You're going to Alzheimer's, Down syndrome, you name it. We're making big progress, and it also means you got a more robust defense against disease. I always tell people, while the military is incredibly important and very important to this district economically, you're much more likely to die in a pandemic than you are a terrorist attack. So you better be ready to defend against SARS and Ebola and things like that. And, we're seeing that now with the potentially new epidemic brewing in China. And if you don't have a strategic stockpile of vaccines to inoculate you, and you don't have the research capability ready to analyze the disease and develop the vaccine, then believe me, you're every bit as vulnerable as we would be to a nuclear attack or certainly a terrorist deal. So, finding those kinds of things where you can work together on and get big things done, I think is really important. And I've tried to operate that way, and by and large, it's been pretty successful.
So what else keeps you going? I mean, after nearly 2 decades in Congress and many more years before that, whether it be consulting or in other kinds of office, what continues to drive you, keep you motivated, and want to continue to fight the good fight?
Well, I think I think you can make a difference in public life, and I think you get enormous opportunities to do that, and so I enjoy that. We'll spend a lot of time. One of the big things for me in my career was to get through a BRAC round in 2005 and not lose any jobs at Fort Sill or at Tinker. As a matter of fact, to bring thousands of jobs up from Texas, or to work with Jim Inhofe when Barack Obama. There's 31 AWACS, those big planes with those big radar things in the United States Air Force. 28 of them are stationed right out here, Tinker Air Force. 32, I guess. And 7 of them were going to be eliminated by President Obama. And I got Jim to get them authorized in the Senate budget, and then I got the money for them, and then we had a showdown negotiation with the administration. And the president actually threatened to veto the entire defense bill, $600 billion, over 3 things. One of them were 7 airplanes at Tinker.
Wow.
I'll never forget his ledge liaison coming in and showing me the statement of administration policy, it's called. It's called a SAP. And I said, I looked at him and he said, if you come back off these planes, and I said, I tell you what, I don't think the President of the United States is going to veto a $600 billion bill over 7 airplanes at Tinker Air Force Base. Now, it's 350 jobs, it's about $340 million to maintain those airplanes, and we needed them militarily. We use them all the time. And we won. He didn't veto it. He signed the bill. The planes are still there. And I can give you instance after instance like that. When we could do earmarks, I was able to get $10 million. City of Norman came to me. We had a city with a hospital on one side, population on the other. They needed an underpass on Robinson. We were going to tax ourselves to pay for it. Could you get a match from the federal government? And I was very lucky. Jim Inhofe was chairman of the appropriate committee. We were working on a highway bill. I went to him, made my case, and he said, yeah. And so we got $10 million to do that. And every time I go by that, I think, well, that's something tangible. Or the exit lane off I-35 to Riverwind. And so there wouldn't be a traffic block up off all I-35 or on Highway 9,
Yeah.
Things like that. You can get some very practical things done that are local. You also have the opportunity to do big things. And I'm excited about what the potential and the possibilities are.
Well, and I thank you for all of those things. But as we wrap up our conversation, I reflect on my years in the legislature, and while I always cherished more my trip south on I-35 coming home every day than the trip up there. But I got to tell you, when I'd walk into the state capitol and you look up in the dome, and I was always very humbled by the opportunity that I had to serve. And so, as we wrap things up, just share with us what it's like to walk into the U.S. Capitol. I mean, such a place of history and nobility.
The greatest in the entire history of the United States since 1789, the first session of Congress. Only 12,200 or so people have gotten the opportunity to serve in the House of Representatives, about 2,500, 2,600 in the United States Senate. So, just to walk on there, and now we're no longer in the same chamber, although when I walk through Statuary Hall, I'm thinking, well, this is where John Adams was, and this is where Abraham Lincoln was. But I can go to the floor of the chamber, and I can say, well, that's where John Kennedy used to sit. That's where Richard Nixon used to sit. That's where Lyndon Johnson used to sit. It's a great privilege, and some of the great struggles and crises in American history occur on that floor. I mean, the chamber I go into began being used as the House of Representatives, the new house, in 1859. So the entire Civil War, you're on the floor where people were struggling to save the Union, clearly the greatest crisis in American history. And I look up at the podium, I think that's where FDR stood and delivered his speech for the declaration of war against Japan in December of 1941. So I just think the opportunity to participate hopefully be a voice for the views and the values of the people you represent. Every time I look at the button, I look up, I said, I think I'm saying what I think the majority, at least, of 770,000 or so Oklahomans want me to do. And they're going to judge me in 2 years, and which they should. And no problem with that. So not many people get to do that, and you can see the difference that you can make. If just one person working really hard, knowing what they want to do, can have an enormous impact at a critical moment, and you never know when the moment will be.
Sure.
You never know when the conversation will be. Some of the most meaningful things are discussions with other members that you never see, that aren't speeches on the floor. And again, it's exactly the same in the legislature, or the hard work that goes on in committee that nobody's watching, but that's where the bill that's going to pass is really crafted at. It's not in the stage speeches on the floor.
Yeah.
So those kind of things are privilege, and I'm just grateful, that the voters have allowed me the opportunity to do it. And I consider anything along the way to have been pretty minor in the way of sacrifices, given the opportunity I was given to serve. And you only have it for, a brief period of time, relatively speaking, and you need to make the most of it when you're there.
Well, you've done an exceptional job in the time that you've had. We are so honored to have you there serving us, and we really appreciate it. You are fantastic being our congressman from the 4th District, and we always know that you're representing us quite ably up in Washington, D.C., and always put a great face on the 4th District, Oklahoma in general, for us, which we truly appreciate.
Thank you, that's very kind.
Thank you for being with us today on Chamber Chat.
Absolutely.
And always being available to us. So.
Very good.
Well, folks, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an honor to have Congressman Cole with us as we discussed his life, his service, and our nation as a whole. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you soon, whether it be at the next Chamber event or the next time we have our Chamber Chat. We'll see you real soon. Thanks.